If you noticed me up here smiling as the choir was moving into position, I realized that this morning's beautiful fall flowers that are here for worship and to sustain us and remind us of God's presence and the beauty of God's earth were brought to us today by Minnie Pearl. The tag's still on it. Anyway, that's what happens when you're trying to get everything going and you just overlook stuff. But that's okay. You know, sometimes people in church get a little too serious. And since there's so many of you here this morning, maybe you'll need this lesson a little bit, perhaps. You know, there's a kind of a thing, and I saw you all doing this, welcoming and greeting and catching up with people and checking in, touching base, checking on folks. That's what it means to be in community of faith. That's one of the beauties of being able to worship together, and one of the things that my heart and my soul, my mind too, have missed so much over this time. I mean, it takes effort to call everybody individually, and you're here and be able to worship together. And so that's such a wonderful thing for us to be able to do again. But sometimes there's a balance in that. One of the best worship services I ever attended was a Lutheran church at a first baptism at seminary. One of my friend's cousin was having their first communion, and so they invited me to go, and I'd never been to a first communion. I'm a Methodist, you know, you have communion as an infant, as a child, as you begin to take solid food, you kind of get used to what communion means and is. And people say, well, sometimes children just don't understand what's going on in communion. And I'm like, yeah, none of us do. It doesn't matter if we're 1 or 100. We don't fully understand and grasp the greatness of what's happening in communion, but we try. And the more we learn, the more we understand, the more we understand, the more we seek to understand, and it continues to grow our whole life through. But, you know, so that was a neat worship service. All these kids in the back, they had rocking chairs in their sanctuary, and these kids were rocking us the whole time through the service, and nobody missed a beat. I loved it. You know, I mean, it brought a liveliness to that, and I fully understood what it meant for the early church to be able to come together and to worship in the marketplaces. I love that we have a processional cross here. You have heard me say more than once, I love a good procession. We do it on Palm Sunday, and as long as I can breathe and waddle through, we're going to have a processional on at least Palm Sunday. But that processional cross that went before the crowd was originally used in the marketplace. That's why it's on a stick like that. They had a place in a base that they could set that cross, and anywhere that they gathered, they put a cross up, and people would know that they were worshiping there in that marketplace. And I always think of that, like even in the hustle and the bustle and the haggling for prices, that there was an ability and a capability to worship God in the early church because of a cross and join together in that even a marketplace. We don't need this sanctuary, but it's a beautiful place. It does kind of walk in and you're kind of awed by it. It kind of just lifts our spirit. It's not the normal, same old. This church is not the YMCA. It's a different thing. It's a place for worship, and it's been set apart by those who've come before for worship, and we continue to do that. That's part of the beauty of it. But now there is a warning that sometimes comes with too much rockedness in the sanctuary. I always think of this story. It's one of my favorite prelude stories in all the world. Susan might appreciate that, and other musicians might be able to identify. You know, sometimes we are talking and we don't hear the prelude going on, and so we kind of, you know, it just is background music for our conversation. Sort of. But sometimes it begins to stir our hearts and move us into a place and to bring us away from the business of the world and the normalcy, and moves us to a place to worship. In Statesville at First Baptist Church, if some of you have been in there, it's a big sanctuary. It probably holds 1,000 people, and it's one of those with a big center aisle and goes down and pews on both sides. So it's kind of a awing kind of space, and beautiful. But they told the story of the organist who was playing this prelude that started out with everything and the organ going wide open. Two little ladies on the front row section were continuing their conversation right during the post-prelude. And it went from one of those great big loud pieces to that quiet little section. And they had already had their thought prepared, and it was on the tip of their tongue. And before they could hit the emergency brake on what they said, over the whole of the sanctuary came the advice of, that's why I always fry my beans in fat back. They got just a little too zealous. So there's a balance. Susan, don't play one of those pieces next week. See if we're paying attention. She's just going to play on because she's like, oh, if I don't play a long time, the preacher's going to start talking early. But sometimes it is. It's that way. You know, there's a certain thing about shh, and there's a certain thing about conversation and catching up and knowing what's going on. In the Gospel of Mark, we've heard 2 or 3 stories fairly recently about the disciples trying to get people who wanted to get to Jesus and access Jesus to be quiet, to hush. And they persisted, and they went ahead and told everybody that they fried their beans in fat back, and they wanted to get to Jesus now. They didn't let what the disciples said or what the neighbors said prevent them from actually getting to who they needed and who they wanted in their lives. Whatever it took to get through to Jesus, people were willing to do. That's like, I appreciate us wearing masks and being willing to wear masks so that we can come together and to worship God in this place now. To not wait, to not put it off further, but to do what we can to care for one another and yet boldly move on through where we are. The disciples, shh, be quiet. Don't bug him. Wait. And yet they persisted. Blind Bartimaeus kept going, kept talking. What I think is most interesting about Bartimaeus is that he's blind. Can't see Jesus. He can just hear that he's there. You've heard me say this before, and I try to be honest. It's not that I don't believe in the miracles of the gospel. It kind of worries me and it frustrates me that they can't happen more frequently, that they don't happen. Because I believe God can do it. I just don't know why, but I know that we live in a fallen world, that things are not perfect. God's kingdom has not yet been revealed, but it's coming. It's part of the Christian hope. It's part of the trust. It's part of the understanding that yes, things are not perfect, but it's coming. Because it's God. It's God's way. But blind Bartimaeus was able to understand and see and to know that Jesus was there. And his faith believed that Jesus could make a difference in his life. Didn't matter what other people said. Shh, shh. He just kind of kept on pushing through. It wasn't this bold individualism of, I want this, or I want that, or I deserve this. It was this idea of faith and understanding. Perhaps it opened up a possibility for God's will and God's way to be revealed in the world. Because it wasn't just Bartimaeus that knew that he couldn't see. His friends and neighbors, others around him. And I love the way in this text of Mark that it says, 52, go, your faith has made you well. That Bartimaeus' trust and faith has made it possible to be in the presence of Jesus and his sight restored. And Jesus tells him to go your way, to go. Bartimaeus follows Jesus on the way. He becomes one of those disciples. He follows. Commentator at the end of the paragraph basically said, part of what we learn from this text is that Bartimaeus, without his sight, was able to see who Jesus was. And those who had their sight weren't able to see. Couldn't see, couldn't understand. who Jesus was and what they could do for him. But Bartimaeus saw, his eyesight was restored, and he followed Jesus on the way. There are a lot of places in our lives in which we find ourselves perhaps limited, not having the power or the strength or the perseverance or to make a difference, to see things in a different way. We think that the normal of the world has become our normal, and it's just this treadmill kind of effect that we just keep going through the motions. Day after day after day. We miss the potentiality for what God can do in our world for us and for other people and for the whole world around us. We miss that opportunity. And we kind of need to hear this passage perhaps as a reminder of the possibility of God and God's kingdom for the world and for us. I always think about that in the midst, somebody said the other day, they said, well, the Delta Plus variant is coming for the pandemic. And I'm like, I don't know that I want to know enough about that yet. I mean, I thought this thing maybe 2 or 3 weeks, but come on. It just keeps going. I'm signed up to get my booster this week. I'm doing all I can, and I'm wearing my mask. I am still going out and around other people. But I tell you, I choose my times wisely. I don't want to get in the middle of a big crowd. I'm just not ready for that. Because I want to protect people. I want to take care of myself, but I also want to take care of other people. Oh, but the persistence just keeps going. Perhaps it's good for us to hear once again that there are end to pandemics and situations that are ongoing and lasting and keep continuing even when we can't. Some of you in this room remember the day that World War II was over. A war that went on for 4 years here in America, but longer around the world. And the persistence of those who fought the good fight to fight back evil was conquered. I mean, and it ended. Or the news that our soldiers were coming home from Vietnam. There are times in which we hear of things that are visions that have been completed. I thought of, the promise to go walk on the moon. And, there are people that kind of doubt that happened. Somebody said they asked one of the older astronauts about that. Did America actually walk on the moon? And he said, yeah, 8 times. He said, you might be able to fool people once, but 8? Come on. Let's move on. Or the end to diseases of polio or other pandemics that have ravished and hurt and harmed others in our lives and in our world. But there's an end. And we can take hope that there will be an end to this pandemic too at some point. We just got to hold fast and go a little longer and be a little more bolder to wear our mask when not everybody's wearing masks around. Figure out ways to enjoy these beautiful fall days outside instead of indoors. We're still holding out on the weather to figure out if we can worship the first Sunday of November outside or we'll have to be inside. It just depends on I don't figure y'all really want to bring your umbrellas. Although Fred's getting some practice at the football game. But there will be an end to this pandemic. We need to hear that again. We need to continue to understand that. It's getting to that time of the year. It's like Thanksgiving. I've started feeling it. I think it's Hallmark. They put on the Christmas movies this weekend, or something. I don't know how long they've been showing them, but I discovered them this weekend. Those blooming things, they're all the same. And yet I watch it like it's going to change my life. I'm like, I've already seen this story with different people. But look at that pretty Christmas tree. I should do that this year. But there's a part of Thanksgiving, there's a part of fall, and I thought of sometimes it's just hard in the midst of going through the struggle to move on into a place of praise. But I thought of that hymn, Now Think We All Are God. Some of you have sung that over and over again. It's page 102 in our hymnal if you wanted to look at it, but if you probably know it, I'm not going to try to sing it, don't worry. But it was written by Lutheran pastor Martin Rincart of Saxony in late 1600s. After the 30 Years' War had plumaged and tore through, killing people, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, and the community that he lived in went through a severe pestilence and famine. Didn't have enough to eat. He was the only pastor in the town. And they said because so many people died, including his own wife, that he had to do 50 funerals a day. They estimated that he did 4,000 funerals over the course of that year. And this is the song that he wrote. And think we all are God. To be able to have praise and understanding, even in the time of difficulty, even in the time of being harmed and can't go and depressed and sad. Part of what we do as people of faith is we lean upon God, who is the Creator, who's our Redeemer, and continues to sustain us, to make us part of that vocal group in a world that wants us to and say, I believe, I hope, I trust, I understand what God does for me and can do for our world and will do for all of us. And I'll keep going because of that nurturing and sustaining spirit that God offers to us through God's forgiveness. I don't know about you, but sometimes I get kind of sedentary on the way of faith. I'm like, I've got it good. I'm good. I'm in good shape here. And yet there's that still small voice that says, there's more you can do. There's ways you can see. There's another way to love. There's another way to care. There's a way to reach out. There's a way to be of hope in the world. There's a place to throw off our blankets and to get up and to follow after Jesus, to understand and to see with new eyes. All glory, honor, and power be to the one who was, who is, and who is to come. Amen.